Stuart Ayres, welcome. Great to have you.
Yeah, it's really great to be here, Peter.
I want to really dig in deep on the state of development. There's a big perception out there that developers are these big, greedy people. They're always out to get everybody. But development as a business and behind the scenes is a very tough business. What's the state of property development, particularly residential, at the moment in New South Wales?
Yeah, well, it's a very challenging environment for developers. We're in the midst of a housing supply crisis, which by its fundamental nature means we're not delivering enough houses. The people who have to deliver those houses are developers. So if we're not supplying enough houses to the market, that means developers aren't in a position to do so. And so their business is being constrained. So it's a very challenging environment for developers at the moment. And the main reason around that is the feasibility of delivering projects. What we see around the country, here in New South Wales particularly, is government policy trying to push infill development. So more higher density development, often closely associated with transport hubs. Here in New South Wales, we've got policies around transit orientated development, or TODs. But generally, there's a principle of trying to get higher density developments closer to existing centres of economic activity or closer to the CBD. That means that developers have been challenged by government to do more high-rise developments, to do mid-rise and low-rise developments, but the cost associated with those developments has never been higher. And so when the costs of doing that exceed the capacity for the market to pay, well, then the developer's in a position of extreme risk, and you would expect them to function like any other business. Where that risk outweighs the reward, they're less likely to participate in projects.
What would the development industry prefer? If that's not the most ideal because it's expensive and the feasibilities don't stack up, in an ideal world, what would you like to see?
Well, I don't think government should be too prescriptive on the types of houses. I think we should let the market decide where people want to live, because everyone's different.
Yep.
Some people want to live in a 2-bedroom apartment close to the city or in the city because it suits their lifestyle. Some people might want to live in a 3 or 4-bedroom apartment with a family close to the city because that's what they like. Other people might want to live in a townhouse. Some people might want to live in a terrace. Families like the idea of living in a 4-bedroom home on 400 to 700 square metres of land somewhere in the outer arc of Western Sydney because it's a bit more affordable and it suits the things that they want. Governments probably shouldn't be prescribing where or the typology that people live in. They should let them decide to do that. What government should be doing is setting policy conditions or creating policy that allows the market to respond to those. But I think one of the things that government really is challenged by at the moment is the economic conditions. They don't control interest rates. They can influence inflation by the way in which they manage their own spending, because they're by nature the largest single spender in the economy. But I think governments who are trying to push against the economic wave at the moment with policy settings are not always going to see results. And that's, I think, a challenge that the New South Wales government is facing at the moment. Strong push towards infill development, but the economic conditions aren't suiting that type of development.
But you've been in government, and we'll touch on that. You have that vantage point, which is very unique in the industry. If the government is trying to shove down the industry and shove down the consumers that we're going higher,
Yep.
and most people that I talk to don't want a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment. They want a house.
Yep.
So if the people don't want it and the developers are saying it costs us more, it's too expensive, it isn't stacking up, why is it coming from the top? Is it because the top is out of touch, or the top doesn't want to invest in greenfield, for example?
Yeah, so I think there's very much an idea inside government that the cost to the government using taxpayer money, but the way the government is thinking about this is how they manage their own budgets. The ability to fund infrastructure for new dwellings is lower in infill development sites. There's already a lot of infrastructure that's in place, whether it's a road or a school or an existing hospital or an existing water pipe. And the cost associated with that infrastructure is more likely to be an upgrade of that infrastructure. And so the cost per dwelling in those infill areas to government is lower. But if the market feasibility isn't there, then you're not going to get any development. So the fact that the cost for that infrastructure to the government is lower doesn't really mean anything if there's no dwellings being built. I think the thing the government needs to focus on is it has to do both. And it has to do both greenfield development and infill development because the market's demanding both. We're a little bit older, 40 and above. Probably most of our social network is family orientated. And so the types of people that we interact with might be more in the house, 3, 4 bedroom home type environment. But there are lots of young people,
Yep.
young professionals, couples without kids that might want to live in a smaller dwelling, closer to amenity, closer to their professional work. And so there's market demand for that. Government, like I said in my earlier remarks, probably shouldn't be too prescriptive, but what it should be doing is thinking, how can we facilitate all types of developments? Because when you're in a housing supply crisis,
Yep.
you need more of everything.
Yeah, and the other issue is price, right? It's all very well to build close to the city center where there's amenity, but if a two-bedroom apartment has to be delivered at $1.5 million, there's an affordability issue. The
Yeah.
feasibility doesn't stack up, and we're back at point number one.
Yeah.
Other than finance, because finance is a function of the interest rate cycle,
Mm.
developers are paying more for the cost of construction. What's it like in the other parts of the feasibility? So, for example, the cost of construction, the
Yeah.
ability to deliver, planning. What are those things looking like at the moment?
Yeah. So everything's more expensive. Land's never been more expensive. So if you're acquiring land, and I do think this is one area that confuses policymakers and the public in general. What we tend to see in the development space is people that have had land for a long period of time. And sometimes the connotation of land banking has a negative view around it, but but people might have owned property for a different purpose. They might have been agricultural businesses on the outer arc of Western Sydney, where that for a long period of time was a perfectly reasonable use. In fact, government policy at the time would have almost expected it. They're not land bankers; they're people that ran a particular type of business on some land, and the city caught up to them, and now what we see in a more modern time is a higher and better use for that land. And so those landowners are going to explore those options. But if you're purchasing land in the market now,
Yep.
perhaps if you're trying to agglomerate and aggregate properties together to get a larger footprint, then those land costs are as high as they've ever been. Construction cost is high because of materials. We have started to see some slowing down of the rate in which materials are growing. So it's not to say that there isn't still escalation. It's just not at the rapid rate that we saw in that heavily disrupted COVID period. We're seeing very strong wages growth at the moment. And so we see that being led by a lot of what's happening in the public sector that pushes out through, particularly through the union movement and then into highly unionized activities. That is putting pressure on wages. So that's another cost that the developer's got to carry. So when all of those costs are going up, they're
Yep.
pushing an upward price point.
If land is one of the biggest hindrance and one of the biggest costs outside of finance, why aren't we pushing towards the regions? Because we have some beautiful regions, but it just never happens. We keep talking about it year in, year out, and our regional centers aren't exactly booming with development opportunity.
Yeah, so I think we're about to enter an interesting period of time for areas outside of metropolitan Sydney. I think those areas that are a bit closer to metropolitan Sydney, places like the Central Coast, Wollongong and the Illawarra, and I'm particularly bullish about the future of the Hunter, and particularly those areas west of Newcastle, into sort of Maitland and Cessnock, where they're within a reasonable period of time for travel for commuters to access good quality employment. The improvement of transport across across the Hunter and the Central Coast locations, access to Sydney is also creating a different commuter class. So I think that those areas have quite good, strong growth prospects ahead of them. But once again, the constraint is going to be the ability for government to continue to facilitate infrastructure there. The home buyer is going to be a contributor to that infrastructure, but the thing that will slow those regions down is if government continues to pull the handbrake on funding enabling infrastructure.
Now, I've started to see a trend emerging over the past 5 years of some Japanese developers coming back into the market, particularly master planned communities. From your vantage point, are you seeing other signs of overseas developer interest coming into New South Wales, or are they still isolated anecdotes?
Yeah, I think there is a little bit more interest internationally, partnering with good local developers. And I think this is the critical point. So, what we see in Australia is a bunch of really good businesses, people who know the market conditions, from a micro space. So, you might know Hurstville, or you might know Liverpool, or might know Penrith really well. And so being able to partner with people in those locations, right through to kind of tier 2, tier 1 developers, finding capital partners, I think will enable those developers and builders to be able to move to projects with a bit more confidence. Just yesterday, I was out at Meadowbank, apt residential, relatively new business, doing 209 build to rent apartments right next to Meadowbank Station, funded with finance partner out of the Netherlands.
Wow.
So those types of projects I think are coming along. I think BTR will be an interesting product for institutional capital to come into the property market on. It follows a little bit more of the institutional capital methodology.
Yeah.
It's a annuity from an annual rent. The risk you take is how much occupancy you've got, and there's a long-term appreciation of the asset. You're not taking risk on settlement in the short-term transaction of build to sell. So I do think more institutional capital will look to find its way into BTR here in New South Wales.
Now, many people know that you have a former political life.
Yep.
And it's quite unique because you came out of politics into this industry. From your political experience, viewing now the political landscape, where do you see policy opportunities? What should be put on the ticket in terms of policy reform with that vantage point?
Yeah. So one of the things that the Premier said very early when he took on the role of the head of government was to say that he wanted to go up, not out. I think that principle is really being challenged by economics. And if there's one thing that I learned over my 13 years in Parliament, I spent 9 years as a minister, is that government's hard. It's really challenging. There's the public service, there's the public itself, there's finding conditions to ensure that private capital keeps coming into the market, the role that government needs to play, sometimes the role government needs to do to get out of the way. So all of these competing interests, plus managing this behemoth that is the New South Wales government, or whatever state that state parliamentarians are looking at. And quite frankly, if you're running the national parliament, the size of the national agenda is huge as well. So they're constantly being challenged and competition for time. But what I think is happening now more than ever is that there's across a wide spectrum of people in the community, there's a recognition that the housing crisis is the primary policy challenge of our times. And I've read a bit around people acknowledging that for a long time, like every homeowner loves the idea of their house going up in value. But I think we've crossed a line now where those homeowners know that their children, the next generation, is not going to be able to afford a home unless there's something that changes. And so that's starting to challenge the political orthodox that's existed in the past. And I think this will be an ongoing issue for a long period of time.
So is it the Planning Act? Like what is it in government? Because we hear the talk.
Yeah.
This premier came and there's been so much talk. Delivery isn't there. Execution's not there.
Yeah.
What's the policy missing piece?
So there's the challenge here is there's no silver bullet.
Okay.
Right. There's no one single solution. You need to have a more efficient planning system, because an inefficient planning system means that projects stay in planning or under approval or under assessment for a longer period of time. The longer something stays in that period, holding costs go up. Those holding costs have to get factored into what the end consumer pays. So you do want a more efficient system. You want a government that funds enabling infrastructure, because enabling infrastructure is what's going to allow those greenfield development sites to come online. They're the most feasible pieces of product in the market at the moment. So good taxpayer investment is investment in enabling infrastructure. It opens up more communities, creates more homes, it generates tax receipts for government. That's a positive thing. So you definitely need more of that. I like some of the work that's been done around the building commissioner and strengthening the quality of product, particularly in high-rise buildings. There's always going to be tension with builders around whether there's too much emphasis from government. But what we can't walk away from is the consumer's got to have confidence in the product they're buying is going to stand the test of time. So I think continuing to refine that is going to be an important thing that we do. And then the Planning Act itself, here, particularly here in New South Wales, my strong view is it's just become too complex.
Okay.
It's too big. It doesn't have the level of flexibility to push back to more code-based assessments. Whilst merit does have a role to play in the system, it's probably not there enough. And we don't place a great enough emphasis on strategic planning upfront, engaging the community there, setting the goalposts, and then allowing the developers and the assessors to work within that framework. So if you tick all the boxes,
Mhm.
you should be able to move through relatively quickly.
Is there anything the feds can do? I mean, we've got a federal election coming up. I think housing is going to be one of the biggest areas,
Yeah.
other than a little bit of a tweak to super or, a co-investment scheme. What can be put on the table from a federal policy perspective?
Yeah, enabling infrastructure, enabling infrastructure, and enabling infrastructure. It's the one area where the federal government can deploy its balance sheet, its budget across states that has a material impact on what can be delivered. And it'll bring forward the construction of houses in a market that we desperately need that to happen.
What's your number one on the infrastructure wish list for New South Wales? What would you love to see? What piece of infrastructure or what type of infrastructure? Because when you were in
Yeah.
government, you built the metros.
Yep.
And now we're having a discussion of if they're going to be finished. So
Yeah.
there's nothing new being put on the table. What would you like to add?
Yeah. So from a housing perspective, the not sexy stuff. Water treatment plants in southwest Sydney, extension to water pipes across the Sydney water network, the provisioning of connections to arterial roads that will open up land. They're not anywhere near as politically attractive as an airport or a metro line or a big tunnel road, but they're absolutely critical for delivering the next wave of development. I would strongly support governments planning over the longer term to continue to expand out mass rapid transit and large scale infrastructure projects, particularly into Western Sydney, and improved connections into the Illawarra, Central Coast, and the Hunter. But right now, I think the big challenge is that stuff that's often under the ground
Mm,
that you don't see once the house is there. But a house doesn't become a home unless when you flick the light switch on,
yep.
the light comes on. When you flick the tap, the water comes out, or when you go to the toilet, it flushes.
Yeah, exactly.
So you need all of those things, and ideally, you need a local road that allows you to get into your community as well. So that low to the ground enabling infrastructure is where I think government will get its best bang for its buck right now.
What have you learnt about yourself as a leader, stepping away from politics, stepping into this new role, working in a very exciting and important industry? What's Stuart Ayres learnt about himself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. How much I love being involved in a team. I always sensed that was important to me when I was a minister and I had a really strong ministerial office around me. Great group of people that I worked with, my own electorate team, even engaging with senior members of the public service. But I think the UDIA team that I work with now is a great crew of people. So I'm really enjoying that. And I love being a problem solver. And so I felt like that's the challenge I stepped up to in government. Now I'm sitting on the other side of the table, still trying to solve some of the same challenges, perhaps in a different environment, different economic conditions. But I like to bring some of my political experience to those conversations. But fundamentally, yeah, I've learnt that I really love the concept of problem solving.
Awesome. Well, thank you. We wish you all the best. You've got a really important role. You're bringing a new charisma to an industry that's kind of had its tough times. And it's a very important industry because you're going to build and deliver the homes of the future. So we wish you all the best and thank you for your time.
No, thanks very much, Peter. The one thing that I constantly reinforce to people right across communities, the development industry, and government is that we're all trying to do exactly the same thing here, and that is create more places people can call home. It's been a fundamental cornerstone of the success of Australia. The idea of, we think about it as the Australian dream. We can't be a country that doesn't allow people to own the place that they live in or have a prospect of doing so. At the moment, and probably for the first time in our history, our population is sensing that we're tracking away from that opportunity. We definitely need to correct course. And I hope that my time at the UDIA will help the development industry step into that, and then also policymakers and government leaders achieve the same thing.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.